The Mekong's waters slapped lazily against the sides of the narrow boat, its creaks punctuating the oppressive silence. Linh Nam revealed itself through a gauzy veil of mist, a village caught between time and terror. My contact, a wiry man named Dao, greeted me on the pier. His face was gaunt, his eyes darting like those of a prey animal sensing a predator. "Detective Graves," he muttered, offering a half-hearted bow. "Elder Hong is waiting. They fear your arrival will stir it." "It?" I asked, stepping onto the slick boards. "The Hantu. The spirits." Dao's voice cracked. He wouldn't elaborate, his lips tightening as if words alone could summon the entity. As we walked through the village, I took in the setting: wooden stilt houses, thick green foliage, and the ever-present scent of incense. Altars stood outside nearly every home, laden with rice, lotus blossoms, and blackened chicken bones. Villagers watched from their doorways, their faces masks of suspicion and despair. The elder's home was the largest, a ramshackle building perched precariously above the riverbank. Elder Hong sat cross-legged on a bamboo mat, his eyes clouded but alert. He beckoned me forward with a frail hand. "You came," he rasped. "Perhaps too late." He gestured to a low table, where 3 worn photographs lay. Each depicted a young woman, smiling brightly, the vibrancy of life captured in their faces. Tan, Min, and Lu. My gut twisted. Whatever had befallen them had stolen more than their lives, it had cast a pall over the entire village. 3 lives taken, all within a fortnight, Hong said, his voice trembling. They were found, defiled. And each had a red string tied around their ankle. Red string? I frowned. A ritual? Hong nodded. It binds the Hantu. But the strings, they were torn. That night, I began my investigation. The first body, Tan, had been discovered near the bamboo forest. Dao led me there, his lantern casting eerie shadows that danced among the trees. The site was marked by a crude wooden cross and the faint scent of decay. She was walking home from the pagoda, Dao whispered, his hands trembling as he pointed to the clearing. We found her here, stripped, her throat. He stopped, choking on his words. Kneeling, I examined the ground. Though weeks had passed, the soil bore faint depressions. Someone, or something, had knelt beside her body. Nearby, I found the remains of the red string, frayed as though gnawed by jagged teeth. As we moved to the second site, my mind raced. The similarities were undeniable, the placement, the ritualistic desecration, the binding string. Yet, the methods felt strangely personal. Min had been found near the river, her body partially submerged. Her arms bore strange symbols, carved deep into the flesh. Lu, the third victim, had been taken from her home. The villagers whispered of claw marks on the walls and strange, guttural sounds heard that night. They say the Hantu only hunts the guilty, Dao murmured. But these girls, they were innocent. As the village slumbered fitfully, I made my way to the old pagoda where Tan had last been seen. The path was overgrown, the air thick with a palpable dread. My lantern flickered as I approached, casting long shadows on the crumbling walls. Inside, the pagoda was a hollow shell, its once brilliant murals faded to ghosts of their former selves. I felt a tug of unease as I spotted a shrine in the corner, littered with offerings, rotted fruit, melted candles, and a small statue of Kuan Am, the goddess of mercy. The juxtaposition was jarring, mercy in a place so steeped in despair. But it was the scratches on the walls that caught my attention. Spirals, jagged lines, and a crude image of a figure with empty eyes. Beneath it, an inscription in ancient Vietnamese read, "Beware the hungry dead." A sudden rustling drew my attention. A figure darted through the doorway, disappearing into the night. I gave chase, my heart pounding. The figure was fast, but as I reached the edge of the forest, it stopped abruptly. It was Dao. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with fear. You shouldn't have come here, he stammered. It knows you now. The next morning, I confronted Elder Hong. His frail demeanor faltered as I laid the evidence before him, the ritualistic bindings, the symbols, the scratches in the pagoda. His hands trembled as he poured tea, avoiding my gaze. Tell me about the Hantu, I demanded. He sighed heavily, his voice laden with years of guilt. The Hantu is not a single spirit, he began. It is born of betrayal. Long ago, this village committed a grave sin, a woman was wronged, her child taken. She cursed us with her dying breath. And now, the Hantu claims what is owed. As Hong recounted the tale, the pieces began to fall into place. The woman, En Hung, had been a healer accused of witchcraft when crops failed. She was stoned by her neighbors, her child taken as penance for her supposed crimes. On her deathbed, she swore vengeance, binding herself to the village with a blood curse. And the red strings? I asked. They are our only defense, Hong replied. Each string is tied with a prayer to ward off her hunger. But someone has undone the bindings. The elder's revelation clung to me like a cold shroud as I wandered through Linh Nam's labyrinth of weathered paths. Every step felt heavier under the weight of his words. Someone had severed the red strings. These bindings were not just rituals but the village's last defense against an ancient malevolence. And now, with the strings broken, the Hantu prowled freely, no longer tethered by the prayers of the living. The first stop was Tan's family home. A crude altar stood in front of their house, the embers of incense barely glowing in the moist air. Tan's mother greeted me with a haunted gaze, her face as gaunt as the withered offerings piled before the altar. Behind her, a small boy crouched, etching lines into the dirt with a twig. The pattern was unsettling, spirals interwoven with crude humanoid shapes. Tell me about the red strings, I asked, my voice low but firm. She recoiled as if struck, clutching a talisman strung around her neck. They were to protect her, she murmured, her voice cracking. But they failed. She failed. Failed how? I leaned closer, my shadow falling over her. She hesitated, her trembling hands clutching the talisman tighter. She broke promises. Brought shame to the ancestors. That's why it took her. Before I could press further, the boy, Tan's younger brother, spoke without looking up. His voice was eerily calm, his attention fixed on his crude drawing. The Hantu doesn't forgive. It knows what's in our hearts. I crouched beside him, examining the patterns he traced. What do you mean? He finally met my gaze. His eyes were old, far older than they had any right to be. Tan lied. The Hantu feeds on lies. The boy's words churned in my mind as I left the house. I had planned to move on to Min's family, but something about the boy's cryptic statement gnawed at me. What promises had Tan broken? What lies had drawn the Hantu to her? The village grew darker as I walked, the setting sun casting jagged shadows across the dirt paths. An oppressive silence blanketed the air, broken only by the occasional crackle of a burning altar or the distant drone of insects. The atmosphere felt alive, as though the very ground resented my presence. At Min's house, her family was less forthcoming. Her father, a wiry man with deep-set eyes, sat sharpening a blade. The rasp of steel on stone was his only reply to my questions. Finally, a girl emerged from the shadows of the doorway, Min's younger sister, clutching a battered doll with its head sewn on backward. She went to the river, the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. To meet him. Who? I crouched to her level, trying to soften my tone. Who did she meet? The girl glanced nervously at her father, who continued sharpening the blade, his expression unchanging. She said he promised to break her strings, she murmured, clutching the doll tighter. To set her free. That night, I ventured to the river alone. The air grew colder as I approached, carrying the faint stench of rot that clung to the water like an invisible miasma. A small altar sat near the bank, its candles long extinguished. The offerings left there, mangled fruits, a bundle of feathers, and an empty clay bowl, seemed more like an insult than a tribute. The ground squelched under my boots as I searched for any trace of Min's final steps. I found a patch of earth where the grass had been flattened. Beside it, faint markings carved into the bark of a nearby tree caught my eye. They resembled claw marks, but no animal had made them. Each groove ended in a deliberate, unnatural curve, forming the shape of a hand. As I examined the marks, the sound of footsteps splashing through the water made me spin. A figure stood across the river, its form indistinct in the pale moonlight. It was humanoid, but its movements were wrong, jerky, almost like a puppet on frayed strings. "Who's there?" I called, drawing my revolver. The figure tilted its head in an unnerving mimicry of curiosity. Then it let out a sound, not a word, but a guttural, wet gurgle that crawled under my skin. Before I could react, it darted into the forest with inhuman speed, its footsteps echoing unnaturally. I chased the figure into the thicket, my breathing ragged as branches clawed at my coat. The forest was alive with sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant croak of frogs, and that same wet gurgling laugh that seemed to follow me, mocking my pursuit. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing. The figure stood at the edge, its back to me, swaying slightly. As I approached, it turned, no, it snapped, its head toward me. What I saw froze me in place. It wasn't a man. Its face was a mask of decayed flesh stretched over a skeletal frame, its hollow eyes burning with faint, sickly light. It opened its mouth, revealing jagged, unnatural teeth, and spoke in Min's voice, "Why didn't you save me?" A surge of icy dread flooded my veins as the creature lunged forward. I fired blindly, the gunshots ringing through the forest. When I finally steadied my aim, it was gone, leaving only the acrid smell of decay. I staggered back to the village, my mind a chaotic storm of fear and questions. As I reached the safety of the lantern-lit streets, a man stumbled out of the shadows. His face was pale, his clothes disheveled. He dropped to his knees before me. "Please," he sobbed, clutching at my coat. "I didn't mean for this to happen." I pulled him upright, glaring at him. "Who are you? What do you know?" The man, who introduced himself as Hui, admitted to cutting the red strings. His voice trembled as he confessed. "They said it was the only way to be free. Tan begged me. Min begged me. Even Lo. You cut all their strings." I shouted, shaking him. He nodded miserably. "I didn't know it would call the Hantu. They said the strings were binding their souls. That the elders were using them as sacrifices." I released him, letting him crumple to the ground. My mind reeled. If the girls had willingly severed their ties to the strings, they had unknowingly offered themselves to the Hantu, feeding the curse's hunger and growing its power. Hui's confession lingered in my mind like a sickness as I made my way back to the pagoda. The crumbling walls seemed alive in the pale moonlight, shifting subtly as if they might collapse under the weight of their secrets. I had no choice but to return. This forsaken place held the answers, even if uncovering them meant peeling back layers of horror. Inside, the air was suffocating, heavy with the scent of decay and damp stone. The carvings I had previously noted now seemed more vivid, their crude shapes depicting scenes of anguish, emaciated figures crawling toward a towering form with hollow eyes and sharp antlers. At the altar, a faint sound of dripping water, or blood, echoed in the darkness. Among the scattered scriptures, I found the brittle bamboo manuscript Elder Hong had mentioned. Its pages were fragile as cobwebs, each stroke of ink imbued with desperation. One passage stood out, written in jagged, erratic characters that barely clung to the surface. To bind the hunger, one must bear it. To unbind it, one must bleed. The red string is not salvation, it is delay. The realization struck me like a cold wind. The red strings weren't a solution, they were a stopgap, a trembling hand trying to hold back an avalanche. The village's safety had always depended on a single soul, one person chosen to endure the Hantu's insatiable hunger, to act as a vessel until their death. Without this vessel, the curse would spread, feasting on every lie, every betrayal, until nothing was left but despair. I left the pagoda at dawn, the rising sun casting pale, trembling rays through the mist. The village stirred faintly, its people moving like shadows, quiet, furtive, and haunted. I returned to Elder Huang's home, gripping the fragile manuscript as if it might vanish before I could demand an explanation. He sat in the corner, his figure slumped, his frail hands fumbling with a worn prayer wheel. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of medicinal herbs and despair. Without preamble, I slammed the manuscript onto the table between us. "You knew," I growled, my voice low but sharp. "You knew what the red strings were for." Hong flinched, his cloudy eyes flicking to the pages. His hands trembled as he reached for his tea. "You think I didn't carry this weight, detective," he rasped. "You think it hasn't haunted every breath I take." "I think you gambled with lives you weren't prepared to lose," I shot back. "The red strings are a cage, not a cure. And someone was supposed to carry that burden. Who was it?" The elder exhaled heavily, his voice breaking. We thought the Hantu would stay bound, even without the vessel. We had no choice." "There's always a choice," I said coldly. He met my gaze then, and I saw it, years of guilt, etched into every line of his face. "The vessel must be tied to the curse by blood," he admitted. "But when the time came, none of us were willing to choose." "So, you left the village defenseless," I said, the weight of his failure pressing down on me like a vice. Hong looked away. "We didn't think the Hantu would wake so soon. We thought the strings would hold. They didn't." I left Huang's home filled with a cold fury. His confession had provided one crucial piece of information: the vessel had to be someone connected by blood to Hung, the woman who had cursed the village. My mind worked furiously, connecting dots as I moved through the village. The answer struck me suddenly, and when it did, it felt as though the air had been sucked from my lungs. Dao. The quiet, nervous guide who had led me through the village. The one who had seemed to shrink under the weight of every shadow. He wasn't just a villager. He was Huang's grandson. He was the one destined to be the vessel. I found Dao on the outskirts of the village, crouched before a crude altar built from broken bamboo and tangled red strings. His shoulders were shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't hear me approach, his focus entirely on the altar. "Dao," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. He jumped, spinning to face me. His eyes were bloodshot, his cheeks hollow. "Detective," he stammered, his voice cracking. "You shouldn't be here." "You're the vessel," I said, stepping closer. "You're the one meant to bear the Hantu's hunger." He recoiled, his back hitting the altar. I can't do it," he whispered. "It's too strong. I hear it in my dreams. It wants more than I can give." "It doesn't matter what it wants," I said firmly. "If you don't bind it, the village will burn." Before Dao could answer, a guttural scream tore through the air, freezing us both in place. It was coming from the village center. Without a word, I grabbed Dao by the arm and pulled him with me, my heart pounding as we sprinted toward the sound. The scene was chaos. Villagers were scattered, some running, others huddling by their altars. The source of the scream was Li's family home. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. Li's mother sat on the floor, wailing, her hands clawing at the walls. "Stop her," someone shouted. I pushed through the throng to find the source of their panic. Li's father stood before the wall, his hands slick with blood. He was scrawling words across the surface with his bare fingers, each stroke frantic and jagged. "Your turn." "What's happening?" I demanded, pulling him away from the wall. He turned to me, his face pale, his eyes vacant. "It told me to write it," he whispered. "It's coming." The air grew colder, an unnatural chill that seemed to creep into my bones. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, shifting subtly as though they were alive. I drew my revolver, scanning the room. The villagers pressed closer, their whispers blending into a low murmur of fear. And then I saw it. In the darkest corner of the room, something stirred. It moved slowly at first, its form blending with the shadows. When it stepped into the dim light of the lantern, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The figure was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its torso gaunt and twisted. Its head tilted at an impossible angle, and its eyes burned with a faint green glow. The stench of decay filled the room, sharp and choking. It opened its mouth, and a sound emerged, a voice, but not one. It spoke with layers, as if every soul it had consumed was screaming through it. "You cannot stop me," it rasped. "Your strings are broken. Your blood is mine." Before I could react, it lunged. My shot rang out, deafening in the small space, but the figure dissolved into shadow before the bullet struck. The room fell silent, the oppressive chill lingering like a malevolent presence. The Hantu wasn't just hunting, it was warning us. The night that followed was one of terror incarnate. The Hantu's chilling presence permeated every corner of Linh Nam, its spectral shadow trailing through homes, extinguishing lanterns, and snuffing out courage. The villagers locked their doors, but the wood felt thin and useless against the creeping dread outside. Every creak of the wind, every stray shadow seemed alive with malice. I stood watch near the village center, my revolver loaded and charms clutched tightly in my coat pocket. Elder Hong and Dao joined me, though their faces betrayed the strain of mounting panic. The elder's frailty seemed magnified in the flickering firelight, and Dao's hands trembled as he gripped a blade far too large for his comfort. "They won't survive another night like this," I said, breaking the suffocating silence. "We must complete the ritual," Hong replied, his voice trembling but resolute. "But it requires sacrifice." Dao flinched, stepping away from his grandfather. "It's not fair," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You knew this would happen, and you didn't stop it." The elder's gaze hardened, though his eyes glistened. "The curse doesn't care about fairness, Dao. It only hungers." The oppressive stillness of the night was shattered by a deep, guttural groan that seemed to reverberate from the earth itself. It wasn't the wind, it was something alive, something ancient. The fire at the center of the village dimmed suddenly, and the air grew frigid. "They're coming," Hong whispered. Before any of us could react, a woman stumbled into the square, her face contorted in terror. Her clothes were tattered, her arms streaked with blood. She collapsed at my feet, clutching at my coat. "Help me," she gasped. "It took them, it took my family." "Where?" I demanded, but her eyes rolled back as she fell unconscious. From the edge of the square, a figure emerged, tall and spindly, its elongated limbs illuminated by the faint glow of the dying fire. It wasn't human. The Hantu's hollow eyes bore into me, and for a moment, I felt its hunger, vast, insatiable, like a void. It opened its mouth, but no words came out, only a cacophony of screams, dozens of voices, each layered over the other, pleading, wailing, and accusing. "You cannot bind me," it rasped finally, in a voice like cracking ice. "Your blood will not save you." The Hantu retreated into the shadows as abruptly as it had appeared, but its message lingered. The ritual wouldn't just require a vessel, it would demand blood. As I stared at the unconscious woman, I realized she was a warning. Her survival was temporary, the Hantu didn't leave prey behind for long. Back at the pagoda, I laid out the ritual's requirements with trembling hands. Dao stood nearby, his face pale, his eyes locked on the diagram etched into the scroll. "Explain it again," he demanded, his voice quivering. "The vessel must be willing," I said, my throat dry. You have to stand in the center of the binding circle. The chance will tether the Hantu to you, trapping its hunger in your spirit. And then what? Dao's voice was barely a whisper. I hesitated. And then you carry it. For the rest of your life. As dawn broke, a pale and hollow light spread over Linh Nam. We gathered in the center of the village to begin preparations. Hong drew the binding circle in ash and blood, a mix of chicken and goat, blessed with incense and prayers whispered under his breath. The villagers watched from their windows, too afraid to approach. Dao stood at the edge of the circle, his breathing ragged. What if I'm not strong enough? He asked. You will be, I said, though the words felt hollow. Hong began the chants, his trembling voice rising and falling in an ancient cadence. Dao stepped into the circle, clutching the red strings in his hands. The air thickened, and the world seemed to hold its breath. And then the Hantu came. It didn't approach like a physical being, it materialized in the center of the circle, its form flickering between shadow and flesh. Its face was a shifting mosaic of every victim it had claimed, each visage staring with dead, accusing eyes. Dao screamed as the Hantu lunged at him, its claws ripping through the strings as if they were cobwebs. The circle faltered, its protective wards dimming as the creature tore through the barrier. Get him out! I shouted, grabbing Dao and pulling him from the circle just as the Hantu's claws raked the air where he had stood. The ritual had failed. And the Hantu was growing stronger. That night, the village descended into chaos. Doors were splintered, windows shattered. The Hantu moved through Linh Nam like a storm, claiming 3 more lives before vanishing into the forest. The survivors huddled in the center of the village, their fear palpable. We have to try again, Hong said, his voice breaking. If we don't, it will devour all of us, I finished grimly. This time, I took charge of the preparations. The circle was reinforced with salt and iron filings, its symbols carved into the earth instead of drawn. I carried a revolver loaded with silver bullets, though I doubted they would stop the Hantu. Dao stood at the edge, trembling but resolute. I won't fail, he said, more to himself than to me. As Hong began the chant, the air turned deathly cold. The Hantu emerged again, but this time, it was different. Its form was larger, its movements more aggressive. It snarled as it approached the circle, its clawed hands scraping against the iron filings. The chants grew louder, the symbols glowing faintly as the ritual took hold. Dao screamed as the Hantu lunged at him, its shadowy form colliding with his body. The air erupted with a deafening howl as the binding took effect, the circle blazing with light. And then, silence. Dao collapsed to the ground, his body trembling. The Hantu was gone, but its presence lingered, a cold, oppressive weight that settled over the village. When Dao opened his eyes, they were no longer his own. They glowed faintly, sickly green. The vessel had been chosen. The air was thick with dread as we carried Dao from the circle. His body was limp, his breathing shallow. The villagers gathered in tense silence, their eyes wide with fear as they watched him. Elder Hong knelt by his grandson, his trembling hands brushing the dirt from Dao's face. What have we done? Hong murmured, his voice barely audible. The village was deathly quiet. Even the animals seemed to sense the weight of what had just transpired. The once familiar sounds of life, chirping crickets, the occasional bark of a dog, had vanished. Linh Nam felt as if it had slipped into another realm, one ruled by something far older and crueler than time. As I helped Hong lift Dao into his home, I felt a chill run down my spine. The ritual had worked, the Hantu was bound. But Dao's faintly glowing eyes told me the truth, the hunger wasn't gone. It was contained, but only just. Hours passed before Dao stirred. When he did, his screams were inhuman, a guttural wail that sent villagers running to their doors. Hong and I held him down as his body convulsed violently, his hands clawing at the air. It's inside me, he rasped, his voice twisted with layers, his own and another, darker presence. I feel it, crawling. Dao, I said firmly, trying to keep his focus. Listen to me. You're stronger than it is. You have to be. His eyes darted to mine, and for a moment, I saw something utterly alien staring back. It whispers, he said, his voice breaking. It wants me to break the circle. It wants out. The villagers began whispering among themselves, their fear growing with each passing moment. They saw Dao not as a savior, but as a ticking time bomb, a vessel teetering on the edge of unleashing the Hantu once more. As night fell, Elder Hong gathered the remaining villagers in the square. His frail voice carried through the still air, his words heavy with guilt. This curse, it is not in Hung's vengeance alone, he began. It is ours. We made it. The villagers gasped, their faces pale in the flickering light of the fire. And Hung was no witch, Hong continued, his voice trembling. She was a healer. We begged her for help during the famine, and she gave us what we needed. But when the rains didn't come, we turned on her. We accused her of sorcery, took her child, and left her to die. The crowd erupted into panicked murmurs. Hong raised his hands to silence them. Her curse was not just words. It was a bond, our betrayal made flesh. The Hantu isn't just her hunger. It's ours. It feeds on the guilt we carry, the lies we've told, the lives we've destroyed. I stepped forward, addressing the crowd. You can't undo what's been done, I said. But you can stop feeding it. Your fear, your hatred, these are what give it strength. The villagers' faces were masks of terror, but a glimmer of understanding began to take root. Just before midnight, the village erupted into chaos once more. A blood-curdling scream tore through the air, coming from the direction of the forest. I grabbed my revolver and ran toward the sound, Hong and a handful of villagers trailing behind me. At the edge of the forest, we found a man, one of the farmers, collapsed in the dirt, his face frozen in a rictus of terror. His chest had been torn open, his heart missing. Around him, the trees bore fresh claw marks, their bark splintered and bleeding dark sap. We bound it. Hong cried. It shouldn't be able to do this. It's testing the circle, I said grimly. And it's found a crack. As I turned back to the forest, a chilling realization settled over me. The Hantu wasn't trying to escape. It was trying to draw us in. With torches and weapons in hand, we ventured into the forest. The air grew colder with every step, the dense canopy blocking out the moonlight. Shadows danced unnaturally at the edges of our vision, and the faint sound of whispers echoed around us. Dao led the way, his glowing eyes casting an eerie green light on the path. He didn't speak, but his movements were deliberate, as if he were following an unseen guide. I kept my revolver at the ready, every muscle in my body coiled like a spring. We came to a clearing, and there it was, the Hantu, its form more solid than before. It stood tall, its limbs twisted and elongated, its face a shifting mass of stolen features. In its hand, it clutched a beating heart, still dripping with blood. You cannot contain me, it hissed, its voice layered with countless others. I am hunger. I am truth. And I will never stop. Dao stepped forward, his hands trembling but steady. You won't have them, he said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. You'll have me. The Hantu lunged, its claws aimed for Dao's chest. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he raised the red strings, now glowing with an otherworldly light. The strings wrapped around the Hantu, binding its limbs, its body, its soul. The creature howled, a sound that pierced the heavens, as its form dissolved into the strings. Dao collapsed, the strings burning into his skin like brands. When the light faded, all that remained was silence. We carried Dao back to the village, his body limp but alive. The glow in his eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. The Hantu was bound, but its hunger lived on, trapped within him. In the weeks that followed, Linh Nam began to heal. The villagers rebuilt their altars, their prayers quieter but more resolute. Dao remained in Huang's care, his body frail, his spirit a shadow of what it once was. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried a chilling clarity. "It's still there," he said one evening, staring at the horizon. "It's waiting for me to falter." I left Linh Nam soon after, the weight of its horrors pressing heavily on my soul. As I boarded the boat, I glanced back at the village, now shrouded in mist. The curse was contained, but it was far from gone. The Hantu would always linger, feeding on the fear and guilt of those who dared to remember. And somewhere, in the shadows of Linh Nam, it waited for its next chance to strike.